all, welcome to the first episode of Theory Talkies. Today we are going to discuss about one of the interesting concepts, state of exception. Well, state of exception is a concept that deals with the idea legalizing lawlessness. How do you think one can legalize lawlessness? Bit contradictory, right? So this is how it works. In a state of emergency, when the country is at risk, the government or the sovereign can suspend the rule of law in that country, which means curtailing or controlling the rights, freedoms of its citizens so that the interest of the nation can be secured. So how is it done? This is done either through proper legislation, that is parliament making a law in order to impose state of exception, or through backdoor policies. Often what happens in a phase of state of exception is that the power is transferred from the legislative to that of the executive, that is from the parliament to that of the military and the police. The reason behind such a move is often the rhetoric of the war, the idea that the enemy, either the external or the internal or both, is here to invade the democratic institution in the country. Okay, so this idea of or rationale of an enemy invading can be either true or even fabricated. Most often, state of exception is used to favor the ruling party and its policies. Usually, state of exception is imposed so that anti-governmental resistance or anti-governmental sentiments can be repressed and suppressed in order to secure the interest of the ruling faction and its political ideology. Now let us look at the history of evolution of this concept. It was Carl Schmitt, a German jurist during the time of Nazi regime, who coined this term state of exception in his 1922 work Political Theology. According to Carl Schmitt, when a situation of dire consequence emerges, the sovereign or the government can suspend the rule of law in order to protect the country from the enemy. For him, it is a very positive law that is part and parcel of every work in democratic polity, or is an essential feature of democratic polity. He even goes to the extent of saying that a sovereign is a person who takes decision on state of exception. So his idea that state of exception with its associated violence, brutality and torture is good for the polity comes from his idea of politics. In his 1927 work, The Concept of the Political, he talks about true politics as a place where you distinguish between your friends and your enemy. The idea of enemy is central to the idea of state of exception. So the concept, the idea that someone is here to attack us makes state of exception possible to impose and enforce in any democratic polity. And his idea of state of exception also comes from a Latin idea which is translated as necessity has no law, or necessity doesn't recognize any law, or necessity creates its own law. So when the necessary occasion comes up, the government is freed from the obligation to observe law, obligation to enforce fundamental rights and duties of the government towards its citizens, or can suspend the fundamental rights and freedom of its citizens. And again we see that Carl Schmitt distinguishes between sovereign dictatorship and commissarial dictatorship. So what is the difference between sovereign dictatorship and commissarial dictatorship? Sovereign dictatorship happens when the sovereign wants to suspend the rule of law in a society in order to abolish the existing order or the constitution and reinvent a new constitution or order for the society. Okay, so sovereign dictatorship is all about imposing state of exception or the suspension of law in order to invent a new constitution that would favor the ruling party or the sovereign himself. As opposed to sovereign dictatorship, commissarial dictatorship is about suspending the rule of law or imposing state of exception so that the current state of chaos can be sorted out and the past or the old constitution can be reinstalled as the original legal order of the society. In sovereign dictatorship, democracy is used as a pretext to protect their own interest, but in commissarial dictatorship, democracy becomes the main motive behind suspension of law. Now let us look at the precedents of state of exception in different countries across the world. According to Carl Schmitt, it was in France during the French Revolution that the first recorded instance of state of exception happened. So in a 1789 decree, the French government has passed a law where the power was transferred from the civilian authority to that of the military commander. So the military commander was given the charge to suppress any kind of social unrest and impose peace upon the societies. So later theoreticians are of the opinion that this is the first instance where state of exception was released from its war contest and was placed in a relatively peaceful condition, and it is here to stay. Later in 1848, French government again legislated on state of exception, saying that no one particular person can legislate or impose state of exception on a particular society or country at large. Instead, it has to follow proper deliberations in the legislative council or the parliament, and it has to have the ratification or the approval of the government to impose state of exception. It is indeed a welcome move. But in Germany, it is the head of the state or the sovereign who can decide on state of exception. In Germany, they don't need the approval of the government or the parliament. The head of the state can single-handedly decide on state of exception. Carl Schmitt says that it is an essential feature for a sovereign to decide on state of exception. We see that during Hindenburg presidency and Weimar Republic, there were repeated instances of state of exception, and the rationale given for the imposition of state of exception was to protect the democracy. But later theoreticians are of the opinion that a protected democracy is no democracy at all. Instead, protected democracy has the tendency to become a constitutional dictatorship, and which will eventually evolve into a totalitarian regime. Now let us look at England's stint with state of exception. In England, state of exception goes with the name martial law. So this law was implemented whenever there is war within the realm, within the Commonwealth. But we also see that this law was implemented whenever there was mutiny or anti-colonial struggles in all the colonies of the British Empire. So when we look at the use of martial law by the English government in different parts of the world, we see that it was neither a law nor a right, rather it was a colonial tool to meet certain ends, and we know what those ends are. Unlike all those European countries, in USA we find a rather very positive use of state of exception. Abraham Lincoln in 1862, after the Declaration of Emancipation of Slaves, declared state of exception in United States of America. So this was for ensuring that there will be no violence after the Declaration of Emancipation of Slaves. So state of exception for the first time in history was implemented in order to secure the release of an oppressed community, which is a very positive use of the law. And we all know that all across the democracies, be it the South Asian democracies, be it in Europe, in America, state of exception had been used several times in order to meet certain ends of the ruling faction. So state of exception was indeed used in order to threaten democratic polity rather than securing democratic polity, as the rhetoric goes. Now let us look at where does this theory stand right now. It is precisely at this moment where I have to introduce to you Giorgio Agamben and his take on state of exception. Giorgio Agamben talks about state of exception in his 2005 work, State of Exception. This work was preceded by two other work, 1995, Remnants of Auschwitz, and 1998, Homo Sacer. According to Agamben, state of exception has its origin in Roman institution of Justitian. So what is Justitian? Justitian is a period of mourning, a period where chaos and anarchy prevails, where there is suspension of law following the death of an emperor. This interim period where one emperor is dead and the other is about to take charge is called Justitian. Here in this period no order or law prevails, and he locates state of exception to this period. Schmitt is of the opinion that the transfer of power from one government to that of the other is followed by a general sense of anarchy, chaos and suspension of law. And for him it is natural and it should be considered as something inscribed into the law. But Agamben is of the opinion that this state of anarchy, this state of lawlessness cannot be considered part of a democratic polity. Instead, it is a zone of anomaly. It is a zone outside of legal structure. This is one of the fundamental arguments of Agamben, that state of exception cannot be inscribed into the legal order. It is exterior to it. This sense of lawlessness or the law to suspend the law is outside the law. It can never be part of the law. Agamben distinguishes between state of exception and state of emergency. State of emergency is declared when the country is at risk and the rights and freedom of all its citizens is suspended or controlled. But when it comes to state of exception, a specific community is targeted based on their race, caste, class, sexuality or even political ideology. So the idea of an internal enemy who stands opposite to the ruling faction becomes an important rhetoric when it comes to state of exception. So a rhetoric of a war, rhetoric of a danger is maintained to meet certain ends of the government. So we have seen that state of exception is about targeting a specific community. So how is it possible? So this is possible through identifying specific locales as areas where control or suspension of law has to be implemented. This can be a place where a minority or people with a different race, caste, class or ideology live, or it can also be a place where state has provided for the unwanted populace to reside, like concentration camps or refugee camps. So these areas are identified, sealed off from the rest of the world or the country, and tight control and surveillance are enforced in these areas. Military takes its position in those areas, human rights are suspended, and people here have no access to the civilian courts. The only access to the power is through the military or the executive. So this development of state of exception through campsites is important because this has resulted in unimaginable torture for millions of people who are being tortured for the protection of the so-called democracy. For example, according to the USA Patriot Act, people who are identified as potential threat to national security are classified as detainees who have no fundamental rights, who have no freedoms, and they can be questioned, tortured and punished as and when the government likes. There is no legal protocol that is associated with these people who are identified as potential threats. This is the same with a minority community or people with a different race, caste, class or creed who are being forced to go through a phase of state of exception according to their difference in political alignment or even their biological features. Here in these spaces, the local civil authority or institutions are destroyed, military is given full command over the lives of these people. Thus, state of exception becomes the normative model of governance in those areas. Unlike what Schmitt would have us believe, state of exception was not something positive, but rather it has a draconian side to it. Schmitt wants us to believe that state of exception is a positive law that is to protect the democracy, but Agamben is of the view that state of exception is used to privilege and justify sovereign violence at all cost. Agamben believes that a state security or interest should not be protected at the cost of the insecurity of its own citizens. Summing up, state of exception has two sides. One side believes that state of exception is indeed good for the working of a democratic polity. Carl Schmitt can be considered the leader of the group. The other group, which Agamben also includes, believes that a non-legal structure like state of exception, where there is no law exist, no rule exist, cannot be considered part of the law. It is extrajudicial and it is something that gives a draconian or dangerous face to democracy. So I believe this video was useful to you. Please give me your suggestions and comments in the comment section. Like, subscribe and share. This is Annie signing off. Bye.